On the evening of June 6, 2014, 21-year-old Sarah Patricia Goode moved through her small Medford apartment with the kind of quiet purpose only single mothers understand. She wasn't rushing and she wasn't distracted. She was preparing. Her 4-year-old daughter, Jocelyn, had already finished dinner. The toys were picked up. The nightly routine was unfolding exactly the way Sarah always made sure it did, because structure was how she kept life manageable. It was how she kept her daughter safe. Sarah had been looking forward to this night for days. Not because she was the type to party often, but because she rarely had the chance to. Being a single mother meant that free time was a luxury she almost never allowed herself. Her life was a cycle of working, parenting, sleeping, and trying to keep everything together on her own. So where friends invited her to a small get-together, she let herself feel a flicker of excitement, the kind she didn't express out loud, but glowed quietly behind her smile. Her brother-in-law had agreed to watch Jocelyn. Her mother knew Sarah was heading out. Everything was arranged, and everything felt safe and normal. Sarah finished adjusting her hair in the mirror, then leaned down to kiss her daughter one more time. A soft, lingering kiss on a forehead she loved more than anything else. She whispered something, a gentle reminder that she would see her in the morning, and then she hugged her tightly. If Sarah had known it would be the last time she would ever hold her child, she would have never let go. A little after 10 p.m., she stepped out into the warm Long Island night. The air smelled faintly of early summer. Cut grass, distant barbecues, the low hum of neighbors settling into their Friday routines. Sarah drove her gray 1999 BMW toward the home where her friends were gathering, where music would be low and conversations easy. Nothing about the night suggested danger. Nothing suggested violence. There was only the promise of a few hours of freedom, just enough time to feel young again. At the party, Sarah blended effortlessly into the small crowd. She wasn't drinking heavily or acting impulsively. The photographs taken that night show a young woman who looked happy, relaxed, and comfortable. Her friend said she was laughing, joking, moving from one conversation to another without any tension or worry. She wasn't someone reckless or naive. She was responsible, grounded, and protective of her own safety. But even the safest choices sometimes can't compete with the wrong person's intentions. Among the people at the gathering was 19-year-old Dante Taylor, a young former Marine from Mastic. Several partygoers later told investigators the same story, that Dante had approached Sarah multiple times that night, showing interest she did not return. She wasn't rude. She simply wasn't looking for anything. Sarah didn't want a relationship. She didn't want to flirt. She wanted a night with her friends, not someone else's expectations. But Dante kept trying. Witnesses recall how Sarah politely rejected him, making it clear she wasn't interested. She wasn't flirtatious, wasn't ambiguous, wasn't sending mixed signals. She said no. And for most people, no is the end of the conversation. For Dante, it wasn't. Even though there were dozens of people in the house and plenty of distractions, something shifted in the room every time he drifted near her. Several friends later remarked that they noticed it. His persistence, his fixation. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, but enough to create a subtle discomfort that Sarah brushed off with her typical graciousness. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to ruin the night. She simply avoided him when she could. The party eventually wound down, and people began drifting out into the night toward their cars. Sarah was among them. It was late, and she was ready to go home. Her daughter would wake up in the morning expecting to see her. She always made sure she was there. She got into her car, sent no panic messages, made no alarm calls, and drove away into the same quiet Medford streets she had always known. There was nothing unusual in her movements, nothing to indicate she sensed danger, nothing to suggest she was being followed. The next morning, when Sarah's mother tried calling her, the phone rang, but no one answered. At first, there was no reason to panic. Sarah had been out late. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was still sleeping. Maybe she had switched her phone to silent. But time passed. The hours crept forward, and there was still no message, no call, no sign of her. Family members kept calling, each one expecting her to pick up, to explain, to complain about being exhausted, to reassure them that everything was fine. She did not. The unease spread slowly at first, like a shadow lengthening across the floor. Sarah would never just vanish without contacting anyone. She wouldn't leave her daughter without checking in. She would never miss her nephew's birthday party, an event she never failed to attend. These were not small details to her. They were her life. By evening, the silence was no longer something that could be rationalized away. Sarah's family contacted the Suffolk County Police Department, reporting her missing. They repeated what they all knew so well. This was not a woman who disappeared voluntarily. This was not a woman who ignored her child. This was not a woman who simply walked away. Something was wrong, badly wrong. As officers took the report, as detectives made their first calls, as Sarah's family paced and waited and tried to stay calm, an entirely different story was unfolding somewhere in the wooded parts of Medford. A story no one yet knew to fear. A story no one yet had the strength to imagine. And somewhere, in a place she should never have been, Sarah Patricia Goode was already gone. In the first hours after Sarah Goode was reported missing, there was still a thin thread of hope running quietly through her family. People disappear for many reasons. Phones die. Plans change. Misunderstandings happen. Maybe she had stayed with a friend overnight. Maybe she was embarrassed for coming home late and hadn't called yet. Maybe she was resting, overwhelmed, exhausted. That is what families do when fear first appears. They negotiate with it, bargain with it, offer themselves softer explanations to avoid the truth that is already pushing its way in. But by the second day, that hope began to feel brittle. Calls to Sarah's phone still went unanswered. Messages were still unread. No one had seen her. No one had heard her voice. And the most glaring, unmistakable fact of all remained. She had a 4-year-old child waiting for her. Sarah would never abandon her. She would not let a single morning pass without checking on her. That silence carried a weight that no one in her family could ignore anymore. The Suffolk County Police launched a missing person search almost immediately. Officers retraced their steps, contacted people from the party, and began canvassing Medford. Detectives talked to neighbors, checked surveillance footage, interviewed friends, and searched for anything that might offer even the smallest clue about where Sarah had gone after leaving the gathering. But for nearly 2 days, nothing emerged. The breakthrough came on June 8th, less than 48 hours after Sarah was last seen. It happened in the most ordinary way. Someone spotted a car. A gray 1999 BMW 328i, matching the description of Sarah's vehicle, sat abandoned near a wooded area off of Medford Street, not parked neatly as if someone had walked away, not angled carefully as though someone planned to return. Instead, it looked as if it had been left in a hurry. The call to police went out. Officers arrived quickly. At first glance, the car looked like it had simply been driven into a quiet patch of woods and left. But the feeling around it was wrong. The position of the car suggested abruptness, not intention. The isolation of the spot raised alarm. And then, when officers approached the vehicle and looked inside, the unease hardened into something far more terrible. The interior of the car was in disarray. Items were scattered. Things were overturned. And there was something else, something unmistakable. The presence of blood. Detectives did not need lab results to know that whatever had happened inside this car had been violent. Not accidental. Not incidental. Violent. There were stains across multiple areas of the interior, far more than what a minor injury would cause. There was a red-stained handprint on the exterior. There were strands of hair caught near the window. These weren't theoretical clues or faint suspicions. These were the early signs of a brutal struggle. The officers at the scene stepped back from the car with a sinking heaviness. They had hoped to find Sarah inside, confused or injured but alive. They had hoped to find evidence she had simply left her car and lost her way. Instead, they found the kind of scene that forced an unspoken truth into the open. This was no longer just a missing person case. Something far more tragic had occurred. Meanwhile, volunteers began arriving to help with the search. Dozens of community members gathered, many of them strangers to Sarah but united by a shared fear. A young woman had vanished, and her abandoned car suggested she had been harmed. Groups fanned out across Medford, moving through wooded areas, scanning the ground for anything out of place. They walked in clusters through the underbrush, calling her name, hoping for a response, praying for one. The police worked alongside them, but as hours passed, tension rose. With every unearthed piece of information, the picture grew darker. Detectives interviewed more partygoers. They learned more about the young man who had shown interest in Sarah that night. They learned he had approached her repeatedly. They learned she had not reciprocated. And they learned that after the party ended, he had been seen leaving around the same time she did. But none of that was enough to find her. On June 12th, 6 long, agonizing days after Sarah was last seen, a volunteer search team walked into a wooded area roughly half a mile from where the BMW had been found. As they moved deeper into the trees, the atmosphere shifted. The brush felt undisturbed, but the air carried a density, a stillness that was hard to describe. Then one of the volunteers caught a scent on the breeze, an odor unmistakable to anyone who has ever encountered it. They alerted the nearest police officers. Within moments, searchers were directed out of the woods as law enforcement pushed deeper in. And there, among the trees and soil and summer weeds, officers found the body of a young woman. She was partially concealed by foliage. Her injuries were visible even before the medical examiner arrived. This was not an accidental fall, not a natural death. This was a violent, deliberate killing. Identification came quickly. Sarah Goode had a flower tattoo on her foot, a detail included on her missing person report. When officers saw it, all remaining hope evaporated. The search was over. The outcome every family dreads had become real. Phones rang across Medford that evening. Detectives calling Sarah's relatives, friends calling one another, whispers spreading like a chill through the community. Her family's heartbreak was immediate and indescribable. For days they had prayed for a miracle, clinging to any thread of hope. Now they were forced to face a reality that would reshape their lives forever. Sarah had been murdered. With the discovery of her body, the investigation shifted sharply. The priority was no longer locating Sarah. It was identifying the person who had taken her life. The evidence inside the car became the centerpiece of the forensic analysis. DNA samples were collected. Fingerprints were lifted. Every trace was cataloged. Detectives were determined to reconstruct Sarah's final moments, to understand what had happened between the time she left party and the time her body was left in the woods. And quietly, though no one said it out loud yet, a possibility began to take shape in the minds of investigators. Whoever murdered Sarah had likely encountered her that night at the gathering. Whoever harmed her may have been someone she rejected, someone whose ego could not endure being told no, someone who, in those final moments, was driven not by impulse alone, but by anger, humiliation, and a sense of entitlement that turned deadly. The community grieved. Candlelight vigils bloomed across Suffolk County. Photos of Sarah circulated online with her warm, gentle smile, a reminder of the life that had been stolen. Strangers placed flowers near the woods where she was found. Friends cried quietly, remembering her kindness. Her daughter, too young to comprehend her loss, asked for her mother in the days that followed. And behind all of this sorrow, police worked relentlessly, because now they carried a responsibility that weighed heavily on them. The responsibility to find the person who did this. The investigation's direction was becoming unavoidable. The DNA results would confirm it, and the search for the truth would expose not only a killer but the procedural mistakes, missed chances, and human flaws that complicated the pursuit of justice. In the aftermath of the discovery of Sarah Goode's body, investigators faced a cruel truth. The timeline between her leaving the party and her death was painfully narrow. Something had happened to her in those fragile hours after she walked out of the house and headed toward her BMW. Something violent, something personal, something fueled by emotion rather than randomness. The forensic team worked tirelessly, processing both the vehicle and the wooded crime scene. Every fiber, every smear, every trace was collected. Fingerprints were lifted from the exterior of the BMW. Swabs of biological material were taken from inside the car. Soil samples were bagged. Hair strands were secured. The body itself would later reveal the brutality she endured. But even before the lab results came in, even before analysts could confirm the identity behind the evidence, a name had already surfaced. Quietly at first, then more insistently. Dante Taylor. His name originated not from a criminal database or an anonymous tip, but from the mouths of the people who had been at the party that night. Detectives worked their way through the guest list, interviewing anyone who might have spoken to Sarah or seen her interactions. One after another, partygoers mentioned the same young man, a 19-year-old former Marine, a man who had approached Sarah several times, a man who seemed fixated on her. Witnesses described the same pattern: persistent attention, repeated attempts to talk to her, attempts she did not reciprocate. Sarah wasn't rude, but she was uninterested. She didn't want a romantic conversation. She didn't want a stranger following her around. Friends noted she had moved away from him more than once, brushing off his attempts to flirt. Their accounts aligned on one point. Dante seemed bothered by her rejection. The more detectives heard his name, the heavier the weight of suspicion grew. But wanting answers and having enough evidence to pursue them were two different things. Still, with mounting witness statements, investigators decided to find Dante and question him about the night. When they first contacted him, the interaction was strangely easy. No chase, no resistance. He came in willingly. He sat down. He answered questions. There was no dramatic confession, no obvious fear, no visible panic. If anything, what struck detectives was his composure. He didn't appear shocked that Sarah was missing. He didn't seem confused about why he was being questioned. He behaved as though he had anticipated the call. The detectives collected his DNA, fingerprints, and phone without using proper procedure. They had not read him his Miranda rights. Worse, they did not have solid probable cause to take those samples at that moment. In their haste to act, in their desperate need to find answers, they made mistakes that would later haunt the courtroom proceedings. After the initial questioning, Dante was allowed to leave. Within days, he boarded a plane to Florida. His departure was immediate, sudden, without explanation. Reports later revealed he stayed with family, and his attorney insisted he had not fled but simply visited relatives. But investigators could not ignore the timing. While detectives in New York were uncovering violent evidence inside Sarah's abandoned car, the man witnesses had described as pursuing her that night was now hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, forensic analysts were processing the samples collected from the BMW and from Sarah's injuries. They examined the bloody palm print on the hood. They ran the biological samples against the DNA taken during Dante's questioning. They isolated unique identifiers, checked for contamination, and reviewed results. When the first DNA match came in, it was conclusive. The biological material inside the car matched Dante Taylor. The palm print on the BMW matched him as well. This meant that, at the very least, he had been in physical contact with Sarah's vehicle, an explanation he had not offered during questioning. And combined with witness statements from the party, the evidence began forming a disturbing narrative prosecutors would later outline in court. Detectives also subpoenaed cell phone data. The analysis showed that Dante's phone placed him in the vicinity of the crime scene during the narrow time frame when Sarah was attacked. The digital trail was undeniable. His location betrayed him. He had been precisely where he claimed he was not. When investigators finally connected all these elements, party witness accounts, DNA inside the car, a bloody palm print, cell phone location, they understood that Dante was no longer just someone they wanted to speak with. He was the primary suspect. Back in Medford, Sarah's family waited in agony. They wanted answers, but the answers were slow. They wanted justice, but justice was tangled in procedure, timing, and increasingly complicated investigation. There was one more revelation complicating the case. Months after Sarah's death, information emerged about an incident from 2011. A woman named Nicole Lucas came forward and reported that Dante had once threatened her with a knife and attempted to rape her. She had escaped, but the experience left her traumatized. She was not part of the initial investigation, but when news of Dante's arrest became public, she recognized him immediately. Prosecutors eventually charged him with attempted rape in that earlier case as well. To detectives, this pattern was deeply troubling. It showed that Sarah's murder might not have been an isolated act of violence, but part of a disturbing behavioral history involving predatory behavior and explosive anger toward women who resisted him. Yet the investigation was not as straightforward as the evidence suggested. Because of the procedural mistakes made during his first questioning, the defense would later argue that the DNA collection was illegal and the evidence should be thrown out. This issue would shadow the prosecution, delaying their ability to charge Dante immediately. While prosecutors strategized, investigators in Florida received notice of the arrest warrant from New York. On June 20th, 2014, law enforcement officers in Vero Beach arrested Dante Taylor. The charge they used was unrelated to Sarah's murder, but they knew exactly who they were detaining. After his arrest, he was transported back to Suffolk County, where detectives finally confronted him with the mounting evidence. He denied everything. He denied harming Sarah. He denied being in her car. He denied following her. He denied knowing anything about her disappearance. But DNA does not lie, and cell phones do not invent coordinates. Investigators now face a brutal truth. They were not dealing with misunderstanding, a mistaken identity, or a tragic coincidence. They were dealing with someone who had violently taken a young mother's life. Prosecutors began constructing their case, carefully consolidating every thread of evidence. They expected a difficult trial. They expected a contest of interpretations. What they did not expect was the bombshell that emerged as they reviewed Sarah's digital activity. 5 days before her murder, Sarah had posted unsettling tweets. "I live on a dead end. I see you creeping. Getting threatened for days now. Is that the new thing to do?" These messages, cryptic and frightening, raised disturbing questions. Who was creeping? Who was threatening her? Were these posts connected to her death? Detectives were faced with an uncomfortable reality. The threats referenced in the tweets appear to be unrelated to Dante. They were associated with a conflict involving her ex-boyfriend and his mother. This meant Sarah had been dealing with fear even before that night. It did not mean the ex-boyfriend was involved in the murder. There was no sign he had been near her at the time of the attack. But it complicated the narrative. The defense would later seize this angle, arguing that police had narrowed in on Dante prematurely and ignored other possible leads. But the forensic evidence remained overwhelming. Science had placed him inside the car where Sarah fought for her life. Science had placed him near the woods where her body lay. Science had placed him at the heart of the crime scene. And now the case was moving forward. The tragedy that began as a missing person report was transforming into one of the most emotionally charged murder prosecutions Long Island had seen in years. The next stage, trial, would reveal not only the horror Sarah endured, but the desperation of defense fighting to sow doubt where the truth seemed painfully clear. And as the community prepared to follow the proceedings, one question loomed large. Would the system finally deliver justice for Sarah? The Suffolk County medical examiner received Sarah Goode's body in the early hours after her discovery. Examiners work with the serenity of habit, but some cases press heavier on their shoulders than others. Sarah was young, only 21. She was a mother. She was found exposed to the elements, wounded, abandoned. There is no way to prepare for that. Even professionals accustomed to terrible things feel the weight of a case like hers. The autopsy would reveal the full horror of what Sarah had endured. It would also provide the foundation of the prosecution's case, evidence that could not be twisted by interpretation or softened by wishful thinking, evidence that would speak for her when she no longer could. Sarah had suffered more than 40 stab wounds. The distribution of these wounds told part of the story. Multiple injuries across her head, torso, and limbs, consistent with sustained attack filled with rage and force. Blunt force injuries suggested she had been struck as well as stabbed. Some of the wounds were so deep that the weapon, sharp metallic, had partially broken. A fragment of that weapon remained lodged inside her. Beyond confirming her injuries, the autopsy established what detectives had already feared. Sarah had been sexually assaulted. This detail was not released lightly. Sexual assault in a murder case carries a different kind of emotional gravity. It forces investigators to consider the psychological components of the crime, the motive, the power dynamic, the escalation of violence. The brutality recorded in that report would later become a core element of the prosecution's narrative. This was not a moment of passion, not a spontaneous conflict that spiraled out of control. This was an attack driven by entitlement, anger, and predatory intent. While forensic teams finalized their reports, prosecutors began building their case with a sense of urgency. The evidence was significant, but the defense would be formidable. They had already identified procedural vulnerabilities, issues arising from the initial questioning of Dante Taylor. Those mistakes could threaten the admissibility of certain evidence if not handled carefully. The prosecution's task was clear: construct a narrative so grounded in physical evidence that even procedural errors could not overshadow the truth. They laid out the timeline. Sarah left the party alive and well. Multiple witnesses saw her doing so. She had rejected Dante earlier in the evening, a key detail that contextualized the behavior, but would need to be supported carefully to avoid being painted as speculative. Her car was found abandoned. The blood inside matched her. The palm print outside matched him. The biological material throughout the vehicle was his. His DNA was also found on her body, and his cell phone placed him near the crime scene at the exact window in which the attack occurred. Every element pointed toward a single conclusion. Sarah had been attacked in or near her car, violently assaulted, and then taken into the woods where she was murdered. The prosecution also reviewed the 2011 case involving Nicole Lucas. She described a terrifying encounter in which Dante had threatened her with a knife and attempted to rape her. She had escaped with her life, but the experience left scars. She recognized him when she saw news reports about Sarah's case. She came forward. Prosecutors believed this pattern was relevant, not as proof he committed Sarah's murder, but as evidence of behavior consistent with the crime's nature. They charged him with attempted rape in that earlier case as well, but the defense prepared its own strategy. Their approach unfolded in two major branches. The first involved attacking the investigation itself. They argued that the Suffolk County Police Department had mishandled crucial elements of the early inquiry. They emphasized a Miranda violation, that detectives had collected Dante's DNA and fingerprint samples before properly informing him of his rights. They suggested that law enforcement had rushed the investigation, seeking the simplest path to a suspect rather than the most thorough or fair. They pointed to the threatening tweet Sarah had posted days before her death. The defense implied that other people had motives to harm her, arguing that police ignored alternate suspects, specifically her ex-boyfriend and his mother, who Sarah had claimed were threatening her. The defense stressed that phone records and location data showed they were not near her when she died, but they used the threats to introduce uncertainty. Their second branch was more unsettling. They attempted to argue that any sexual activity between Dante and Sarah that night might have been consensual. They implied that something else or someone else might have harmed her later. This argument was undermined immediately by the nature of the injuries Sarah sustained. But in the courtroom, even weak theories can cause distress for families forced to hear them presented. Prosecutors countered with scientific clarity. DNA, they said, is not consensual when found in the midst of violent injuries. Palm prints do not place themselves on a bloodstained car. Location data does not lie. And consensual encounters do not involve dozens of stab wounds. Still, the defense pressed on, hoping to raise even a sliver of reasonable doubt. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with tension. Sarah's family attended, forced to relive the final hours of a life that had been ripped away from them. They watched as lawyers dissected her last movements, her last social media posts, her injuries. They listened as experts described the wounds that ended her life. They endured the defense's attempts to reshape the narrative. The prosecution called forensic analysts to the stand. They described the DNA process, explaining how it was matched to Dante. They showed the cell phone location data. They brought in party witnesses who testified to Dante's unwanted advances. They brought in specialists who explained how the wounds were inflicted, how the attack progressed, what the struggle might look like inside the BMW. Every witness, every expert, every piece of evidence contributed to a single, devastating truth. Sarah had been alone with a man who refused to take no for an answer, and he killed her. The defense brought forward their own witnesses, focusing largely on police errors and the integrity of the investigation. They argued that the Miranda violation tainted the process. They tried to paint Dante as a troubled young man, someone to be understood rather than condemned. They implied that someone else could have harmed Sarah after a consensual encounter. But when the jury listened to forensic experts, when they saw the photographs, heard the scientific testimony, and understood the brutality described in the autopsy, it became nearly impossible to imagine any scenario in which anyone other than Dante was responsible. The trial lasted weeks. Each day was a marathon of testimony, evidence, and emotional strain. Each night, the family returned home carrying a grief that did not lighten. Each morning, they returned to the courtroom prepared to hear more details they were never meant to know. Finally, the time came for closing arguments. The prosecution painted a clear and methodical picture. Sarah was targeted, assaulted, and killed by a man who could not tolerate rejection. The evidence was overwhelming. The violence was deliberate. The pattern of past behavior aligned. The timeline matched. The DNA was irrefutable. The defense urged the jury to consider investigative flaws, to question the reliability of the evidence collection, to entertain the possibility that someone else might have harmed Sarah. But the weight of forensic proof was too heavy to lift. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom finally fell quiet. Hours passed. Sarah's family waited with a suspended breath that felt like pain. Then the doors opened. The jurors filed in. Their expressions were solemn. Their verdict was final. Guilty on all major charges, including first-degree murder and rape. Sarah's family cried. Some held one another. The relief of hearing the word guilty did not erase their loss, but it finally gave shape to justice. The man who took Sarah's life would spend the rest of his behind bars. Dante Taylor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story was not finished. The court proceedings had concluded, but another chapter, one that no one expected, was about to begin inside the walls of a New York prison, and it would bring yet another layer of pain to everyone touched by this case. When the verdict was read and the courtroom echoed with the single word that mattered, guilty, Sarah Goode's family finally felt a small piece of the world settle back into place. It was not healing. It was not closure. But it was accountability. The closest thing to justice the legal system could give them after losing the person they loved. Dante Taylor showed little emotion as the sentence was announced. Some observers described him as relaxed. Others said he seemed bored, even detached. To the family, that absence of remorse was another wound. They had hoped, perhaps, for some sign of regret, an apology, a tear, any evidence that he recognized what he had stolen from them. But he offered nothing. He walked out of the courtroom the same way he had walked in, silent, expressionless, refusing to acknowledge the devastation behind him. Once transferred to the New York prison system, Dante's behavior did not change. If anything, it worsened. Correctional officers documented multiple disciplinary incidents involving drugs, contraband, and misconduct. Staff reported that he had to be reprimanded repeatedly. At one point, a medical professional documented that Dante himself admitted to dark thoughts and a risk of self-harm. Standard procedures required that he be monitored closely, placed in a mental health observation unit, or at the very least kept under increased supervision. Yet within 24 hours, he was returned to a regular cell. If prison was meant to be the place where he would serve the rest of his life, where he would wake up every day to confront the weight of what he had done, then that future never arrived. His time behind bars lasted barely a year. On October 7, 2017, correctional officers found Dante unresponsive in his cell at Windy Correctional Facility. The official cause, announced later, was suicide by hanging. Medical staff attempted resuscitation, but their efforts failed. Dante was pronounced dead at the age of 22, just a year after being sentenced to life without parole for Sarah's murder. News of his death did not bring comfort to Sarah's family. Instead, it deepened their pain. For them, justice was not simply about punishment. It was about accountability, about a killer forced to live with the consequences of his actions. Suicide to them felt like an escape. It was not justice. It was an ending they did not believe he deserved. But what came next was even more devastating, something no one outside the legal world expected. Because Dante died before his appeals process was completed, New York law required that his conviction be vacated. It was a doctrine known as abatement of initio, a rule stating that when a defendant dies before the appeals process is finished, the conviction and charges are legally wiped away, as if they never existed. The murder conviction that Sarah's family fought for, the trial they endured, the forensic evidence, the verdict, the life sentence, all of it disappeared on paper. To a grieving family, the legal explanation meant nothing. It felt like the system had stolen justice from them twice. first when Sarah was taken from them, and now in death when her killer's conviction was erased. Her sister, brother, mother, every person who loved her, expressed disbelief and outrage. They had been forced to sit through every gruesome detail of what happened to Sarah. They had watched the photographs, heard the medical testimony, seen the evidence that tied Dante directly to her murder. They had listened as a jury, declared him guilty. They had finally breathed, just for a moment, knowing that the man who destroyed Sarah's life could never hurt another woman. Now, with a single legal technicality, the state of New York had undone all of it. It was more than an insult. It felt like a betrayal. The Goode family fought back the only way they could. They began advocating for change. They pushed for a revision to the law, something that would become known as Sarah P. Goode's Law, a campaign to prevent future convictions from being erased when offenders die before appeals are completed. Their argument was simple. A guilty person's death should not erase accountability or invalidate the suffering of their victim. But while the family fought this legal battle, another narrative began unfolding far from Medford. In courtrooms and legal filings initiated by Dante Taylor's own relatives. His mother, Darlene, filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in 2020 against the prison system, alleging that staff at Winnie Correctional Facility had failed to protect her son and had allowed or inflicted physical violence that contributed to his death. The lawsuit claimed that officers had beaten him, hogtied him, thrown him downstairs, ignored his mental health needs, and returned in conditions that heightened his suicide risk. They argued he had been denied adequate medical care and preventative supervision. Some advocacy groups cited Dante's case in discussions about prison reform, solitary confinement practices, and a high rate of inmate suicides within the New York correctional system. His death became an example used by activists to highlight failures in prison oversight. For Sarah's family, these developments were difficult to watch. Their daughter was gone. Her killer had been convicted. But now the narrative had shifted. He was being reframed in court documents as a victim of the system. The family of the man who murdered Sarah had not only filed a lawsuit, but were receiving public sympathy and media attention in certain circles. Meanwhile, Sarah, who had been only 21, who had been a mother, a daughter, a sister, was left without a conviction to her name, without a judicial acknowledgement of what had been done to her, without formal justice. The emotional impact on her family lingered. They described the pain not as something that faded, but as something that settled permanently in their lives. For Sarah's daughter, who had been only 4 years old when her mother died, the loss was lifelong. She would grow up with memories that ended too soon. She would grow up with questions that no child should ever have to ask. She would grow up carrying an absence that would shape her future. Friends of the Goode family spoke about the eerie way Sarah's story seemed suspended between justice and injustice. A killer had been found guilty, yet legally, the case existed in a strange void. A mother had been brutally taken, yet the man responsible would never face the daily reality of imprisonment. It felt as if the world had balancing scales that refused to settle. In response, Sarah's family chose a different path. They stopped focusing on Dante and focused instead on Sarah's memory. They attended vigils. They spoke publicly about intimate partner violence, stalking behaviors, and the warning signs women often feel pressure to ignore. They emphasized the importance of believing victims, acting quickly, and strengthening investigative procedures. Because despite the conviction being vacated, despite the legal technicalities, despite the pain of knowing the system had not fully honored their fight, the truth remained unchanged. Sarah Goode was murdered, and the evidence showed clearly and unequivocally who had done it. Her legacy would not be erased. Her name would not be forgotten. Her story would not be overshadowed by court documents or legal loopholes. The Goode family refused to allow it. But as much as they carried that determination, one question still lingered in the air, unresolved and haunting. How do you move forward when the justice system closes the book but leaves the ending unwritten? To understand the full impact of Sarah's story and the lessons her case forced into the public eye, we must step back from the courtroom, the forensic labs, and the prison walls. We must look at how her death echoed far beyond Medford, Long Island. Because Sarah's story is not only about what happened to her, it is also about what happens every day to women across the United States. In the wake of Sarah Goode's death, The people who loved her were not the only ones forced to confront the reality of what had happened. Her case became part of a larger conversation, one that stretches across the country and touches every community, every city, every quiet suburban street, where people believe they are safe until something shatters that illusion. Sarah's story is devastating, not only because of the brutality of her final moments, but because of how familiar the underlying dynamics are to so many women. At its core, her case is about a simple, everyday situation. A woman said no. She rejected someone's unwanted advances. She asserted her right to decide who had access to her time, her body, her life. And for that, she was killed. This truth is almost unbearable to acknowledge. But it must be acknowledged because thousands of women experience threats, stalking, harassment, or violence every year for the same reason. Because someone felt entitled to them. Because someone believed their rejection was an insult that needed to be punished. Because someone viewed their autonomy not as a boundary, but as a challenge. Sarah's death is part of a pattern that advocates and researchers have documented for decades. When men who exhibit predatory, aggressive, or controlling behavior are rejected, the emotional escalation can be dangerous. In Sarah's case, this escalation was catastrophic. Dante Taylor was not a random stranger. He was someone she had been friendly with at times, someone she had crossed paths with before. She had no reason to fear that speaking to him briefly at a party would result in violence. And yet, the moment she declined his attention, his interest twisted into something dark. The lesson is not that women should live in fear or blame themselves for being friendly, polite, or social. The lesson is that society must recognize these patterns earlier, must take harassment more seriously, must listen when women say they feel uncomfortable or threatened. The signs are often subtle, but they are real, and when they go unaddressed, they can become deadly. Sarah's case also exposed the systemic challenges within investigations of violence against women. The procedural errors made in the early stages of Dante's questioning, not reading him his Miranda rights, not establishing proper probable cause before collecting DNA, were not malicious, but they were serious. They did not change the truth of what happened, but they complicated the path toward justice. And for Sarah's family, those mistakes made the legal process harder and more painful than it needed to be. Then there were Sarah's tweets, the warning she posted days before her death saying she was being threatened, saying someone was creeping outside her home. These messages remain chilling because they reveal how fear can be minimized, rationalized, ignored, even by victims themselves. Whether those threats were connected to her murder or not, they represent what so many women experience: intimidation, manipulation, and unwanted attention that erode their sense of safety long before any physical violence occurs. People often wonder why victims hesitate to involve law enforcement. Sarah's tweets offer one possible answer, reflected in research across the country. Victims fear they won't be believed, or that reporting will escalate the situation, or that nothing will change. In Sarah's case, she did report some threats she received, but the danger still found her. Her story forces us to ask hard questions. How many women are living with fear right now? How many have reported threats that were never taken seriously? How many predators walk freely after earlier victims escape? And why does rejection, a word that should end a conversation, so often ignite violence? Looking at national data, the statistics are harrowing. Every year in the United States, thousands of women and girls are murdered by men they know, acquaintances, partners, co-workers, strangers turned obsessed. Many of these cases begin with the same pattern: unwanted attention, entitlement, persistence, anger. Sarah's name now sits among the victims of this devastating epidemic. Her story also highlights the consequences families face long after trial ends. The abatement of Dante Taylor's conviction, a legal technicality that erased his guilty verdict after his death, inflicted a wound that no courtroom could heal. For Sarah's family, it felt like the world had turned its back on them, as if their suffering was a footnote to procedural rules. They fought to change the law, not out of vengeance, but out of a desire to prevent other families from experiencing the same cruelty. Then there's the most heartbreaking legacy of all, the impact on Sarah's daughter. She was only 4 years old when her mother was taken from her, too young to understand the meaning of death, too young to know that her life had been altered forever. Children who lose a parent to homicide do not simply grieve. They grow up carrying the consequences in their identity, their emotional development, their sense of safety, their trust in the world. Sarah's death left ripples across her entire family. Her mother has spoken publicly about the grief that does not fade, the everyday reminders of Sarah's absence. Her siblings have described how their family gatherings changed forever, how birthdays and holidays became quieter, how laughter carries a shadow of someone missing. They remember Sarah as vibrant, hardworking, selfless, someone who loved deeply and lived with purpose. The loss of such a person reshapes every corner of the lives left behind. To the community of Medford, her murder was a wake-up call. It reminded them that violence can emerge even in places that feel familiar and safe. It led to conversations about community safety, stalking behavior, women's rights, and the importance of early intervention. It inspired vigils and memorials dedicated to Sarah's memory, moments where friends, neighbors, and even strangers came together to honor her life and stand against the violence that claimed it. And though the legal record may show an erased conviction, the truth remains untouched. The evidence is clear. The timeline is clear. The forensic results are clear. The jury's decision was clear. Nothing about Dante Taylor's death changes what happened on the night of June 6, 2014. Nothing changes the brutality inflicted on Sarah or the pain endured by her family.